On the evening of October 6, 1974, in the small town of Ossett, West Yorkshire, England, a horrifying murder took place that would leave the entire nation stunned. The victim was Christine Taylor, a loving wife and mother. The perpetrator, her own husband, Michael Taylor. But what was the reason that caused a loving husband and father to descend into insanity? Welcome to Twisted Logic, and this is the Ossett Exorcist murder. Michael Taylor was a mild-mannered man, a loving husband to Christine, and a doting father to their 5 children. The family and their home was considered mostly a cheerful and happy one by their friends and neighbors. It was noted, however, that he was sometimes prone to minor bouts of depression, the cause of which had been due to a severe back injury he had received a number of years before, and which had left him with chronic pain and an inability to find long-term employment. Apart from this observation, nothing else seemed to be amiss or unusual in the Taylor household. At the time, Ossett had a highly religious population, and most people regularly attending church. But the Taylors had never been particularly devout, mostly skipping church services that were held near where they lived. In a belief that Michael's periods of depression could be somehow eased with a spiritual intervention, a friend of Michael's called Barbara Wardman took it upon herself to introduce him to a church group called the Christian Fellowship Group, which was led by 21-year-old pastor Marie Robinson. Whereas Michael had previously been non-religious, he soon began to attend regular meetings of the group, and he became an active member of the congregation. He became well acquainted with their teachings and quickly fell under the spell of the charismatic Marie Robinson. Michael began spending what seemed an inappropriate amount of time with Robinson, attending more and more meetings and gatherings of the group, and joining Robinson in congregations where they would use the power of God to exorcise people of their sins and speak in tongues. They also began to engage in private rituals in which both Michael and Robinson would stay up all night making the sign of the cross at each other in order to ward off what they believed was the evil power of the full moon. In fact, it soon became clear to the rest of the congregation that Michael had become rather enamored with Robinson. Unsurprisingly, Michael's attitude at home towards his family began to change as a result. He was spending less and less time at home with them, and when he was there, he was sullen and irritable and very argumentative. This was a total character change from the easygoing and peaceful way Michael had once been, and the assumption was that the church group was somehow exerting a negative influence on him. The character change and increasingly bizarre beliefs, erratic behavior, and bad attitude was clear to see to anyone who knew him, but most notably to Christine Taylor, on whom it was not lost that Michael had an infatuation with Robinson. During one congregation, Christine suddenly decided to publicly confront Michael about his relationship with Robinson and openly accused him in front of people of being unfaithful. This triggered a violent reaction. Michael lashed out in an uncontrollable rage, an act completely out of character for him. Now, if it already didn't sound bad or strange enough, it was at this point where Michael's behavior would take a turn for the worse. Michael is reported to have felt an evil influence cast a shadow over him, and then compelled by this force, vented a sudden fury on surprisingly not Christine, but Robinson. He lashed out at her, verbally and physically, to the point that several other churchgoers in the congregation had to physically restrain him, fearing that he would seriously hurt himself or someone else. Michael would claim later to have had no memory of this incident. During the next meeting, Michael Taylor received an absolution, but nevertheless, his behavior continued to become more erratic. Michael was closely watched following this episode. It soon became apparent that his deteriorating, out-of-character behavior seemed to now be permanent, and was in fact getting worse as time went on, with his sanity clearly slipping. The seriousness and frightening condition that Michael was in was so severe that several local ministers became involved and came to the realization that Michael might be under the influence of demonic forces. Finally, the local vicar came to the controversial conclusion that an exorcism should be performed on Michael. Believing that Michael was under demonic possession, local ministers and members of the church arranged an exorcism at St. Thomas Church in Barnsley. On the night of October 5, 1974, 2 priests, Father Peter Vincent and Reverend Raymond Smith, along with a group of church members, began what would become an 8-hour-long exorcism. As soon as the exorcism had started, Michael went into uncontrollable convulsions and fits, and bouts of scratching, spitting, and biting, requiring him to be forcefully tied to the floor. Over the next 8 hours, Michael was subjected to all sorts of indignities, such as having crucifixes shoved into his mouth and being doused with holy water. All throughout, Michael was growling and snapping at anyone who came near him. The priests in charge of the exorcism claimed that the ceremony had managed to ascertain that there were about 40 demons inhabiting Michael's body, representing such traits as incest, bestiality, blasphemy, lewdness, heresy, masochism, and carnal knowledge. As one can imagine, these alleged demons did not go easily from Michael, each one having to be reportedly dragged out kicking and screaming. After 8 hours of this, by 8 a.m. on October 6, 1974, the priest carrying out the exorcism could no longer continue through exhaustion. Strangely, it was decided that the exorcism would have to be finished at a later time, although the priest claimed that 2 demons, those of insanity and murder, were still stubbornly possessing Michael and had not been successfully removed yet. Exhausted and physically drained, they decided to stop and let Michael return home. A minister's wife named Margaret Smith was to claim later that she had received a warning in her mind from what she believed to be God, saying that the demon of murder was going to escape from Michael and kill Christine. She pleaded with the 2 priests to complete the exorcism, but they dismissed her warnings and instead told Michael and Christine to go home to rest and prepare for the next and final part of the exorcism, which was to be performed the following day. But what happened next was nothing short of pure horror. It was about 9:45 the next morning, October 7th, and not 2 hours after Michael and Christine had been sent home to rest up to prepare for the next part of the exorcism, that a police patrol car passing through the normally quiet streets of Ossett came upon a shocking and unnerving sight. Coming around a corner, the officer in the car, PC Ian Walker, was confronted by the sight of a man stumbling around in the middle of the street, naked and covered head to toe in blood. His body was slicked with it. Stopping the car and approaching the man, PC Walker saw the man curl into the fetal position and heard him ranting and screaming over and over,
"It is the blood of Satan."
The police officers approached Michael and immediately called for an ambulance, fearing that Michael had hurt himself or someone else, and tried his best to talk to and calm Michael, who was still screaming and senseless, ranting only about Satan. He continued screaming as the ambulance from the local hospital arrived, and he was placed into it and taken away. The crowd of onlookers who had crowded around the ambulance now told the police that the deranged maniac was Michael Taylor, and gave the officer his address, to which the patrol car then went to. PC Walker, upon arrival at the Taylor house, was surprised and perhaps apprehensive to find a police car there already, which he later found out had been summoned for by frightened neighbors who had heard a commotion. PC Walker approached the house, but was stopped by the sight of his inspector emerging from the front door, bending over and vomiting. "You don't want to see this one son. I've seen nothing like it before, and I've seen a few. It's the wife. She's got no... He's ripped at her son. It's a right mess in there. There's not much of her left. You don't want to see it, eh?" Feeling that he had go in, Walker stepped into the Taylor house, and what he saw there sent chills down his spine. The interior of the front room was destroyed, with signs of destruction apparent even from a cursory look. Blood covered every surface of the room, along with flesh, pulp, and brain matter, and on the floor of the living room lay the bodies of Christine Taylor and the family pet dog, almost unrecognizable. The blood that had covered Michael Taylor was Christine's blood. At about 9:30 that morning, in the Taylor family home, Michael had killed his wife Christine, the woman that he loved and the mother of his children. In a maniacal and deranged attack, Michael had stripped off and strangled Christine and had literally torn off her face with his bare hands. There was no murder weapon involved. He had gouged out her eyes and ripped out her tongue with his bare hands, tearing the rest of her face down to the bone. So much so that she was left unrecognizable. Whilst Christine had died of shock and asphyxiation on her own blood, mercifully quickly, Michael had turned his attentions to the Taylor pet dog, strangling it and literally ripping it limb from limb. He had torn its legs from their sockets and hair and teeth and eyes from the skull. He then left the house screaming and was found by PC Walker a short time later. It was described as being the most horrific crime scene that any police officer who had attended it was ever to see. Michael Taylor was arrested and charged with murder, but his trial would take an unusual turn. His defense argued that he was suffering from insanity induced by a failed exorcism. Psychiatric evaluations confirmed that he had experienced a psychotic episode. Despite the shocking brutality of the crime, Michael was found not guilty of murder due to insanity. Instead, he was institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital where he spent only 4 years before being released. Many believed that he had escaped true justice, while others saw him as a victim of religious hysteria. The case left a dark mark on the small town of Ossett. It also raised serious questions about the dangers of religious extremism, exorcisms, and mental health misdiagnoses. Were the priests responsible for pushing Michael over the edge? Could medical intervention have prevented the murder? Was Michael truly possessed, or was he suffering from undiagnosed mental illness? To this day, the case remains one of the most disturbing and controversial murders in British history. A haunting reminder of what happens when faith, fear, and psychological turmoil collide.